The Canon 80D was known as the camera that can do everything but not one thing really well, like a Swiss Army knife. But what happens when the camera that can do everything becomes the camera that can do everything really well? Well, you get the 90D. The 90D is not a perfect camera by any means, far from it. At this price range of $1,200, it's not exactly cheap, but it has a lot of good reasons for it. This is not a specialty camera like the Fuji X100 or a value camera like the EOS RP. This is a pretty serious prosumer camera that can take on pretty much anything you throw at it, and no matter what it is that you do, the EF mount will probably have a lens for it. I mean, if you only cared about value, most cameras are pretty good nowadays, and if you're someone who's just starting out, then you'll be probably happy with most cameras that cost half as much. But as we all know with cameras, when we spend more money, we don't exactly get the same return in image quality, but we get more in the usability and the build quality. But compared to its older brother, the 80D, which is now much older than any of the cheaper models today, you will still see a big jump in image quality. The 32.5 megapixel sensor will generate comfortably sharper images, although that will heavily depend on what lens you're using. It's the same sensor that's on its mirrorless cousin, the M6 Mark II, which I've talked about on this channel many times. And its native maximum ISO has been increased to 25,600 from 16,000, and even in moderate ISOs around 3,200 or 6,400, in poor lighting conditions you will notice the difference, and as you get higher and higher, the differences will become much more noticeable. Recovering the shadows 5 stops, I noticed the 90D's image had a lot less noise, and it may be hard to see with YouTube compression, but when you zoom in on 100%, it becomes a lot more noticeable. Recovering the highlights, on the other hand, which was never Canon's strength, I think these cameras are pretty equal. But still, providing better dynamic range and low light performance with 30% more resolution is pretty impressive. This being a crop sensor camera with such high resolutions also makes this one of the best cameras for macro photography because you get greater depth of field with 1.6x extra zoom. Not even the A7R4 can match that. The shooting speed has also been improved from 7 frames per second on the 80D to now 10 frames per second and 11 on the live view. Considering the only other Canon DSLR that can shoot this fast is the 70 Mark II or the 1DX lines, and those cameras cost a lot more, and also they can only shoot 20 megapixel images. This isn't just a cheaper version of the 7D anymore, this is a whole new camera on its own. But one disappointment, although this isn't technically a 70 Mark II replacement, I do wish they would have also upgraded the autofocusing system, but you still get the same 45-point autofocus, which works fine for most things, but for tracking fast-moving subjects or focusing on really small areas, it does seem to struggle time to time. I'm not saying it's bad, but if they just updated the autofocus system, I think this would have been a much better camera for the price than it already is. But what I do like is the addition of the joystick, which is amazingly useful on DSLRs. For shooting portraits, I do find using the live view with face and eye detection much more useful. The optical viewfinder now actually has face detection, but I find it to be not as reliable. It may be fine for shooting sports from much further away, but for shooting close-range portraits with a fast prime, you're better off just using the single-point focus or the live view. In terms of its build quality, it is much better than any of the cheaper models like the T8i or the 77D, but not as solid as something like the 70 Mark II or the 5D Mark IV. But it's still weather sealed, which is always nice. Its body weighs about 700 grams, which is about 200 grams heavier than the T8i and about 100 grams lighter than the 5D Mark IV. If you're just looking for something small and light, this is probably not the right camera for you, but once you get used to something like this, you'll never want to go back. This being a DSLR, the grip just fits my hand so nicely, and there seems to be a dedicated button for just about everything you need. I would say the build quality is pretty similar to the 80D, but there were some more unexpected changes other than the joystick. Some of the buttons' heights were increased so you get much better feedback when you press them, and I don't know if it's just because it's newer, but the dials feel a little heavier and they feel less plasticky as well. And the grip is also a bit deeper. The 80D was already pretty comfortable, but this feels a lot better, although this is such a small difference. Still no dual card slots, but at least it's on the side, not in the battery compartment, and it now supports UHS 2. Even with 32 megapixels, you can still shoot up to 25 shots in RAW, which is the same as before, and it only took about 5 to 6 seconds to completely clear the buffer. The 90D uses the LPE6N battery, and apart from the build quality and the 32 megapixel sensor, this is another aspect that will set this camera apart from any of the cheaper models and most mirrorless cameras on the market. According to Canon, while using the optical viewfinder, you can expect up to 1860 shots per battery, which is about 600 shots more than what you get from the T8i and about almost 1600 shots more than what you get from the M6 Mark II. If you only shoot with the live view, then that number drops down to about 500 shots per battery, because at that point this is basically just a mirrorless camera, but that's still about 200 shots more than what you get from the M6 Mark II. Of course, the battery life will vary depending on your shooting style, but for me, while switching back and forth between the live view and the optical viewfinder, and with the LCD screen brightness set to highest, I got about 1600 shots per battery in average, which is still pretty good. And also, if you shoot a lot of bursts in a shorter amount of time, you'll probably get a lot more. While shooting 1080p videos, the battery lasted over 4 hours, which is pretty amazing, which is about 2 hours more than what I got with the M6 Mark II and about an hour more than what I got with the Sony a6600. 4K recording also lasted over 3 hours, which is great because the M6 Mark II always overheats at about 50-minute mark, and the Sony a6600 overheated at about an hour and 20 minutes into it. Speaking of videos, when this camera first came out last year, Canon was going through its weird phase of not including 24 FPS on their consumer level cameras, but I'm glad that has been fixed on a firmware update. Currently, this is the only Canon DSLR apart from the 1DX Mark III that can shoot uncropped 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second with dual pixel autofocus, and it can now also do 1080p in 120 FPS like the M6 Mark II, although there you do lose dual pixel autofocus. I've always thought the 1080p videos were a bit muddy on the 80D, and it's very subtle, but the 90D's videos seems to be slightly sharper, and when you go to 4K, which the 80D cannot even do, the video obviously gets noticeably sharper. And unlike the M6 Mark II, this camera actually has a cropped 4K mode, which increases the sharpness even further. But strangely, the camera couldn't handle this as well, so it overheated after about an hour and 10 minutes into recording, which is still pretty good, but I would only use this mode for shorter clips, not for filming longer interviews or events. Despite the great battery life, unfortunately there's still a 30-minute recording limit, so you're gonna have to babysit the camera whenever you're recording longer videos. This was never a big deal before, but they seem to be getting rid of the recording limit on more and more cameras nowadays, like on the Sony a6400 and the 6600. With this camera's battery life, that really would have been the cherry on the cake, but I don't think Canon will change that anytime soon. So, should you buy this camera? Are DSLRs still relevant? Or if you have the 80D, should you upgrade? Well, obviously, if you like the smaller form factor of a mirrorless camera, or if you're the type of person who thinks you can only produce good results with a mirrorless camera, then I'm not going to convince you to get a DSLR in 2020 no matter what I say or do. I'm not saying DSLRs are better than mirrorless, but you just gotta find what you like, and you can't judge others for what they use, and you just gotta let your results speak for themselves. But if you are in the market for a new Canon DSLR, I think this is the best all-rounder. It has the highest resolution crop sensor and the best battery life on the market, 10 plus frames per second, uncropped 4K with great autofocus. I'm certainly a fan of the form factor, and unlike on mirrorless cameras, you have the option to use the optical viewfinder, or you can just use the live view and use it like a mirrorless camera because the dual pixel autofocus is so good nowadays. If you have the 80D, should you upgrade to the 90D? Well, the 80D is obviously still a great camera, but I personally think it might be worth it. As I always say, no matter what camera you use, your work is only gonna be as good as you, but with the 90D, you're at least guaranteed to get sharper images and videos. This camera honestly is like a Swiss Army knife, except that Swiss Army knives are usually pretty useless at everything, but this is like a Swiss Army knife that can actually cut. So for that reason, I highly recommend it. So that's going to be it for me today. Thank you for watching. And if you have any more questions about the 90D, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them all. And if you are interested in purchasing one of these, check out the links in the description, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.